Hey, what's good everybody? My name's Jeeves and I'm here to bring you a new video. Today I wanted to talk about all 34 racial abilities in Classic WoW and why some are really good and others are kinda mid. The reason I wanted to make this video is because I've seen plenty of race picking guides and race tier lists, but no video specifically talking about racial abilities. Kinda weird. The criteria I will be using to rank abilities include flavor, utility, and power. For example, if a racial fits the flavor of a race really well, but does little to increase the player's utility or power, it will not rank very high. Quick side note, I will not be ranking priest racial abilities in this video because I want to focus on the races themselves rather than the class. I hope that makes sense, so let's go in depth into each race's abilities and rank them. To do this, I will discuss each race and their racials individually before placing them on the tier list. And since I'm a little OCD, I will do everything alphabetically by faction, race, and ability. This means I will start with the Alliance. But before we get into the video, I noticed only a small percentage of my viewers are subscribed, so if you like my videos, please take a second to hit that subscribe button to help me out, and let's get on with the video. Chapter 1. Alliance Racials. Since we're starting with the Alliance, Dwarves will be up first. Dwarves have 4 racial abilities. Dwarves are a stout and mighty race known for their mountaineering and mining prowess. The first racial for the Dwarves is Find Treasure, a neat racial that allows dwarf players the ability to find treasure chests on their minimap. This racial fits the dwarves so well from a flavor standpoint, as dwarves hail from Cosmodan and are known for their mining, archaeology, and exploration. Sadly, Find Treasure is almost purely flavorful and doesn't give dwarf players any utility or power. For this reason, I will be putting it in the C tier. The next ability for dwarves is Frost Resistance, which increases dwarf players' frost resistance by 10. This ability is both flavorful and utilitarian, but it does nothing against enemies that don't cause frost damage. For these reasons, I will be placing it in the B tier. Next up, we have Gun Specialization, a nice racial for hunter players. This racial increases a player's gun skill by 5. Any increase to weapon skill is very strong in Classic WoW, with some weapons being much more powerful than others. Since ranged weapons are the primary weapons for hunter players, this racial greatly increases their power. It also fits the dwarves very well from a flavor standpoint. For these reasons, I will be placing it in the A tier. The final racial for dwarves is Stone Form, which is easily their best racial ability. Stone Form provides immunity to bleed, poison, and disease effects while also increasing a player's armor by 10% for 8 seconds and only has a 3-minute cooldown. That is freaking OP. This racial is really good in PvP, but can also be used in PvE when defensive cooldowns are needed or to remove bleeds, poisons, or diseases during a fight. Not only does this ability fit dwarves when it comes to flavor, it also makes them much more powerful and provides a bit of utility. It also makes a really cool noise when you activate it. For these reasons, I will be ranking Stoneform as our first S tier racial ability. The dwarves are very average in terms of racials, with some good and some mid ones. Let's move on. Up next we have the Gnomes. Gnomes have 4 racial abilities. Gnomes are a small and quirky race that like to tinker with gadgets and occasionally explosives. The first racial for Gnomes is Arcane Resistance, which increases Gnome players' arcane resistance by 10. This fits Gnomes in terms of flavor due to their magical prowess, and gives a bit of utility in the form of damage reduction. However, it does nothing to help Gnome players if their enemy doesn't cause any arcane damage. For these reasons, I will be placing it in the B tier. The next racial for Gnomes is Expansive Mind. Expansive Mind increases a Gnome player's intellect by 5%, which greatly benefits Gnome mages and warlocks by increasing their mana pool and spell crit chance. However, this ability does nothing substantial for Gnome rogues and warriors, but it does go well with Gnomes from a flavor standpoint. For these reasons, I will be placing Expansive Mind in the A tier. Up next we have Engineering Specialization, which increases Gnome players' engineering skill by 15. This skill is absolutely useless if engineering is not one of the 2 primary professions chosen by a Gnome player, but is okay if they choose to learn it. It does fit the Gnome racial fantasy, and that's about all I can say about it. For these reasons, I will place it in the C tier. The next racial ability for Gnomes is Escape Artist, which is easily their best one. Escape Artist allows Gnome players to escape from any immobilization or movement speed reduction effect. This utilitarian ability is very good for PvP and has some niche uses in PvE. Gnomes are small in stature and very intelligent, so it makes perfect sense that they would be hard to immobilize for very long, highlighting how well this ability fits in a Gnome player's kit. For these reasons, Escape Artist will be our second ability to join the rank of S tier. Just like the dwarves, Gnomes have average racials with some good and some not as good. That's about all I'll say about Gnomes. Let's move on to the next race. Next up we have Humans, the flagship alliance race, which is also only one of 2 races that have 5 racial abilities. Humans are very diplomatic and resilient, explaining why they are the de facto leaders of the Alliance. This leads into their first racial ability, Diplomacy. Diplomacy increases human players' reputation gains by 10%. This is very good for obtaining items locked behind reputation barriers and saves a lot of time while rep grinding. This ability is flavorful and very utilitarian, but does nothing to increase the power of human players. These reasons will land Diplomacy in the B tier. Next, we have Mace Specialization, a racial that almost certainly should have been a dwarf racial, and I will die on that hill. Mace Specialization increases human players' skill with both one-handed and two-handed maces by 5, reducing the chance to parry, miss, or land a glancing blow with them. This passive ability increases the power of players wielding these weapons and is good from a flavor standpoint. These reasons will result in Mace Specialization being placed in the A tier. Moving on, we have Perception, an active ability that increases stealth detection for 20 seconds, which has some usefulness in PvP but very limited applications in PvE scenarios. As someone who played a human all throughout 2019 Classic, I used Perception less than 10 times the whole time. Yes, it is utilitarian and adds a small amount of flavor, but this ability is not very useful in 95% of situations human players will find themselves in. These reasons will land Perception in the C tier. Next, we have Sword Specialization, which does the same thing that Mace Specialization does, but for one-handed and two-handed swords. Plus 5 skill in swords and maces does make a noticeable difference at max level for human warriors and rogues and allows them to avoid buying Edge Master's handguards. As a former human Fury Warrior main, that plus 5 skill comes in handy, I promise. Just check my logs from 2019 Classic on Grobulus, wink wink. I will also be placing Sword Specialization in the A tier alongside Mace Specialization. Last for humans, we have the Human Spirit, a passive ability that increases human players' spirit by 5%. This is useful while leveling as spirit increases mana and health regeneration both in and out of combat, which does come in handy especially for healers. The utility and flavor of the Human Spirit will land it in the B tier. Humans have slightly above average racial abilities and are the only race with 2 abilities in the A tier, but they are also one of 2 races with no abilities in the S tier. Let's move on to our final Alliance race. The Night Elves are a magical and mysterious race that worship Elune and live in harmony with nature. Night Elves are the only race in the game with all 4 of their racial abilities being purely utilitarian and flavorful, meaning none of them increase their power. Up first we have Nature Resistance, which increases Night Elf players' nature resistance by 10. Like all other resistance racials, it is okay when fighting mobs that cause nature damage, but pretty useless otherwise. This ability is flavorful due to the way Night Elves connect with nature, but these reasons are why I'm putting Nature Resistance in the B tier. Next up we have Wisp Spirit, which transforms Night Elf players into a wisp when they die. Wisps have 50% increased movement speed compared to other ghosts, meaning Night Elves can get back to their dead bodies faster than other players, which eliminates some downtime while leveling. This is a good ability, but if you play hardcore it is completely useless. The utility and flavor of Wisp Spirit will land it in the B tier. Moving on, we will talk about Quickness, a passive ability that increases Night Elf players' chance to dodge by 1%. This is an okay ability, but not substantial enough to persuade players to roll a Night Elf. It is a bit of utility and flavor, so I will go ahead and place Quickness in the B tier. Last but not least, we have Shadow Meld. Shadow Meld allows Night Elf players to stealth in place, making it hard for enemies to detect them as long as they don't move. This has some niche uses for PvP and spying on the Horde. I was originally going to place Shadow Meld in the C tier, but I forgot that activating it in combat will cause mobs to de-aggro. This is good for survivability while leveling and in dungeons. These reasons will end Shadow Meld in the B tier. Night Elves are the only race in the game with all their racials in the same tier, making them a perfectly average race in terms of racial abilities. All Alliance races have average racial abilities across the board. Most players don't choose Alliance races for their racial abilities, but more for the vibes and the fantasy that each race brings to the table. That is not the case for the other faction, which brings this chapter to an end. Chapter 2, Horde Racials. Orcs will be the first race we discuss for the Horde. Orcs are the embodiment of strength and honor, using whatever means necessary to ensure their survival. Orcs are given 4 racials to assist them in their adventures. The first racial for Orcs is Axe Specialization, which increases their skill with one-handed and two-handed axes by 5. This is much like Sword and Mace Specialization for humans. Axe Specialization increases a player's power as long as they are wielding an axe, while also adding a bit of flavor. For these reasons it lands comfortably in the A tier. Next we have the Orc's best racial ability, Blood Fury. Blood Fury is a strong DPS cooldown for melee classes which increases melee attack power by 25% for 15 seconds while also reducing healing effects on the player by 50% for 25 seconds. This greatly increases player power as well as adding a lot of flavor to an Orc's kit. Even though Blood Fury does nothing for ranged classes, it's strong enough to earn a place in the S tier. The third racial ability for orcs is Command, which increases damage dealt by Hunter and Warlock pets by 5%. This racial is really good for leveling in PvP, but its usefulness in PvE depends on how long your pet can survive an encounter, which normally isn't the whole fight in many scenarios. Increasing a player's power and fulfilling the fantasy of being an orc will land this racial in the B tier. Last up for orcs is Hardiness, which might be the most broken racial in the game from a PvP standpoint. Hardiness increases an orc player's chance to resist stun effects by an additional 25%. 25%. I have no idea how this made it into the game back in 2004. This ability is the culmination of utility, flavor, and of course, power. So much so that it would be absolutely crazy to put this ability anywhere other than the S tier. As you can see, orcs are above average in terms of racial abilities. In my opinion, orcs have the best racials in Classic WoW overall and make a strong case for people to play them. But that's all I have to say about orcs. Let's move on. Next up for the Horde we have the Tauren. As worshippers of the Earth Mother and lovers of nature, the Tauren are a hardy and strong race. Tauren have 4 racial abilities. The first Tauren racial on our list is Cultivation, which increases a Tauren player's herbalism skill by 15 if they choose to take it as one of their primary professions. This is only useful if they do learn herbalism and makes a lot of sense due to the shamanistic and naturalistic characteristics of the Tauren. Due to these reasons, I will be placing Cultivation in the C tier. Up next for Tauren is Endurance, increasing their total health by 5%. This is a good racial for leveling and tanking, but isn't substantial enough to increase a player's power by too much. It does fit Tauren from a flavor standpoint, so I will be placing Endurance in the B tier. Like Night Elves, Tauren also have Nature Resistance as one of their racial abilities. And just like the Night Elves, Nature Resistance is only useful if you're fighting an enemy that does nature damage. This racial does add a bit of flavor to a Tauren player's kit, so for these reasons I will be placing this Nature Resistance in the B tier. Last, we have the best racial ability for Tauren, War Stomp. War Stomp is an active ability that stuns up to 5 enemies within 8 yards for 2 seconds with a 2-minute cooldown. This is useful both in PvP and PvE scenarios, making Tauren a popular pick for warrior tank players due to Endurance and War Stomp. Being able to stun 5 mobs or players every 2 minutes is very strong from a utility standpoint. Anyone who has been bested by a Tauren player in combat will agree with me when I say that War Stomp is comfortably an S tier racial. Tauren are an average race in terms of racials and have the worst racials for the Horde in my opinion, but that's all I have to say about Tauren racials. Up next we have the Trolls, which are the second race in the game with 5 racial abilities. The Darkspear Trolls are a tribal and loyal race, using their cunning and mysticism to survive and outcompete their foes. The first racial for the Trolls is Beast Slaying, which increases the damage that troll players deal to beasts by 5%. While this does increase player power and makes sense from a flavor standpoint, it is useless when fighting any type of mob that is not a beast. For these reasons, I will be placing Beast Slaying in the C tier. Up next is the Troll's best racial ability, Berserking. Berserking is an active ability that increases a troll player's attack or casting speed by 10 to 30% depending on how much health they have left. At full health, the buff gives 10% increased attack or casting speed and 30% if the player is badly hurt. This buff lasts for 10 seconds. Berserking is essentially a mini bloodlust for troll players, which highlights how strong this ability is in every situation. Did I mention it only has a 3-minute cooldown? Yeah, pretty OP. I feel like it's obvious, but I'm going to be placing Berserking in the S tier. Next for the Trolls we have Bow Specialization, which increases a troll player's bow skill by 5. This is really strong for hunter mains as bows are one of their main weapons of choice. This racial is useless if the player is not using a bow. It makes sense flavor-wise due to the trolls being hunter-gatherers residing in jungles most of the time. For these reasons I will be placing Bow Specialization in the A tier. The fourth racial for trolls is Regeneration. Regeneration increases a troll player's health regeneration by 10%, with 10% of total health regeneration continuing during combat. This ability is very utilitarian, but not substantial enough to be considered OP. I will say it's pretty good for leveling. Regeneration is an average racial ability, so I will be placing it in the B tier. Finally, we have the Troll's worst racial and the worst racial in the game in my opinion, Throwing Specialization. Throwing Specialization increases throwing weapon skill by 5. Hooray! This racial is useless. Throwing weapons are not used for DPSing. They are used to pull mobs by rogues and tanks. That's it. It does fit trolls from a flavor standpoint, but it offers no utility or power increase. For these reasons, Throwing Specialization will be the one and only racial that I am placing in the D tier.
Freaking trash.
Trolls have average racials and are actually the only race in the game with an ability in every tier. That's all I will say about trolls. Let's move on to our final race, the Undead. The Undead, otherwise known as the Forsaken, are a ruthless and vengeful race working tirelessly to kill the Lich King and wipe out humanity. The Undead have 4 racial abilities. The first one is Cannibalize, which allows undead players to consume humanoid and undead corpses for 10 seconds, regenerating 70% of their health over the duration. So it's basically free food on a 2-minute cooldown as long as the player is fighting humanoids or undead. This can be very useful while leveling, especially for melee players. I also love this ability more than any other for the flavor it adds to being an undead character. It's also great for BMing in PvP. For these reasons, I will be placing Cannibalize in the A tier. Up next for the Undead we have Shadow Resistance, which increases a player's shadow resistance by 10. Just like all other resistance racials in the game, it's only useful under specific circumstances, but does add a bit of utility and flavor. This is why it will be joining all other resistance racials in the B tier. Moving on, we have Underwater Breathing, which increases underwater breath by 300%. I was going to place this ability in the C tier, but I think it adds more utility than I originally gave it credit for, while also adding a bit of flavor to playing an undead character. There are some quests where being able to stay underwater longer comes in handy. For these reasons, I will be placing Underwater Breathing in the B tier. And last, but certainly not least, we have one of the best racial abilities in the game, Will of the Forsaken. Will of the Forsaken is an active ability that provides undead players immunity to charm, fear, and sleep effects while active. It can also be used if the player is already afflicted with one of these effects. This ability lasts for 5 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown. This is the most OP racial ability for PvP that the Horde players have access to in my opinion, but it also has some niche uses in PvE scenarios. It is purely utilitarian and flavorful, but so much so that it would be insane to put Will of the Forsaken anywhere but S tier. The Undead have above average racials and are easily one of the best races in the game from that standpoint. And this wraps up our rankings of racial abilities. As you can see, the Horde have better racials overall with 5 S tier racial abilities compared to 2 S tier racials on the Alliance.
But Jeeves, the Alliance have more abilities in the A and B tier than the Horde do, so they are basically even.
Let's crunch the freaking numbers then. If I assign number values to each tier, starting with 5 for S tier and ending with 1 for D tier, the Horde have an average racial ability score of 3.53. This lands them in the upper ranges of the B tier on average. The Alliance have an average racial ability score of 3.29, which is the lower end of B tier. So yeah, even mathematically speaking, the Horde have better racials. And again, this is all just my opinion, but I've been playing this game for far too long, and trust me when I say the majority of people would agree with these rankings. In conclusion, racial abilities don't do much to change the way the game is played or how players experience it. Their main purpose is to foster a sense of racial identity and add a bit of flavor while the player adventures. I think every racial in the game has times where they are very good, except throwing specialization. I also think Blizzard did a great job with racial abilities back in 2004, meaning I would offer very few changes to them, as if Blizzard would care about my opinion. But I think that will wrap things up for us today. Of course, feel free to put your opinions in the comments whether you disagree with me or not. Let me know if you have any suggestions for new videos, and please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see y'all again real soon. Peace.